received a package just in the mail at our office, and it had at least 25, 30 cards, postcards, and they were from a grade 7 students at this little school in Bannerif called Sinkadview. And they were asking questions, Dear Grand Chief John, this and that, and a whole series of questions. And so I decided that I would visit that school, and I did yesterday. And the day before, I had my sister phone the school and said, I'll be there tomorrow. I was attending a funeral for one of our elders. And after that, I said I will go to the school to visit with the students. So I showed up yesterday morning at 9 o'clock, at around the same time that they were all coming in. There's 120 students in that school. It's a grade 4 to grade 7 school. And their teacher, for some unknown reason to me, decided that they would have a role model that they would select that year, and they would write postcards to that role model. These are mostly non-Aboriginal kids. So when I showed up yesterday, they shut down all the classrooms and brought all of grade 4, 5, 6, and 7 students into their small gymnasium. And they all sat on the floor and asked me to talk to them. And it was absolutely amazing for me to spend that hour with those students, the questions that they asked. And they gave me another package of postcards, about 60 of them this time. And it was what they learned from the first postcard to the second postcard. So, you know, one young fella there said, did you know that Aboriginal peoples don't live in teepees anymore? Okay, yes, I know that for sure. I got a small 2-bedroom house. And it was like their minds were opening up, and that they were spending this time learning about Aboriginal peoples in the province and across this country. I mean, they kind of got the tribe wrong because we don't live in teepees where I come from, but you know that's beside the point at this time. The fact that they were taking that time and effort was incredibly important to me to see that. So I had to give them a little bit of a history lesson and a language lesson, and they were interested in the kind of work that I did and what I was doing. And I told them that next week that I was traveling to China with the Governor General on a mission on behalf of the Government of Canada. So they were interested in that. I had a really good discussion. To me, it was always going back to the teachings of our elders. When I graduated from the University of Victoria, I went to an Indian residential school like our dear friend Alfie, and went to a Catholic high school, and then went to a Catholic university. I just couldn't seem to break that bond. Not that there was any compelling reason to. At that time, as a young person, you don't really understand the historic dynamics of where you are and what you find yourself in. And, you know, over the years, through education, through learning, through research, started to unravel this historic relationship that we have in this province and in this country with Canada and with the province of British Columbia, and trying to understand the dynamics. So when I come across documents like James Douglas's proclamation of February 14th, I always like February 14th, it's Valentine's Day, but in 1859, it was another day in the history of the relationship of this province with our peoples that James Douglas issued a proclamation, said that, one, all the lands in British Columbia and the mines and minerals therein belong to the Crown in fee. It was, okay, I can understand that, but where did you get the authority to do that or make that proclamation? To declare that all the lands belong to the Crown in fee. So, Duncan, that's, you know, the source of that problem is in those instruments that are there that gave we have in this history from the Supreme Court of Canada a decision that the Crown asserted sovereignty in 1846, and since then, from that date on, there were instruments that gave effect to that sovereignty, including Douglas's proclamation of February 14th, 1859, and so that's the nature of that relationship that we're trying to sort out. As First Nations people, we don't see ourselves being under the thumb of anyone. We see ourselves standing on the history and the riches and the cultures and the languages of our people, standing ourselves up based on who we are. Not because we're trying to be better or smarter or different than anyone else, but because that's who we are as Indigenous peoples, that what we stand on was a subject of laws in this province and in this country, the Potlatch laws of the 1880s that sent people from your communities to jail, that forced you and your father to dance underground so that your father would not end up in jail, as many of our people did here in the Lower Mainland. I think people went to Ocala when it was still there. And so there was always a pushback from our people, and we didn't stand on being status Indians under government laws. We stood on the ways of our people, our traditional ways of our peoples, our potlatches, our clans, our houses, that still stands us in a good way today, and for us to understand that. So always the message is really simple, to get the kind of education that we need in institutions like this, but equally important to get the education that we learn from our teachers, our elders. And so before I went to an Indian residential school, I didn't speak English. And so I learned English at an Indian residential school, so there's a bit of an accent. You're trying to figure out what it is. Part of it is Glasden, but part of it is Irish, because the principals and the teachers and the priests and the brothers and the nuns, they were Irish Catholics. So we learned that Irish English, as it were. So it's Glasden Irish English, right? So try to have a bit of a combination of those various accents. So I don't really, to Glenn, thank you for the message about this 1919 not being eligible to be a lawyer. I couldn't help but I was in northern France a number of years ago. The reason I was reminded, because the elder who passed away, his brother is buried following his death in Normandy in a Canadian war cemetery called Benny-sur-Mer. I had the opportunity to visit his grave, knowing that in this country, in this province, that a disproportionate number of First Nations, Aboriginal, Indian people ended up volunteering for the war effort, even though our people, we were volunteers because we were not Canadian citizens and not regarded as Canadian citizens, and our people went as volunteers in this effort, in this country's effort in the Second World War. These are, just small bits of history, but into the future, as we work our way through, we have incredibly bright, young, talented academics that are setting forth, and leaders setting forth, trying to correct this. And we stand on the trails that have been blazed by people like Alfie Scow. We stand on those important trails that have been, those trails of reconciliation that have been blazed for us. Important trails, important pathways to reconciliation. And it's going to be something that's ongoing. A few days ago, last Friday, 11th, we heard 2 years ago the Prime Minister apologized to Indian residential school survivors. And Chief Judge, Justice, I want to thank you for being there that day. We have never had an opportunity to thank you, but it was an important day for Indian people, First Nations, Aboriginal peoples across this country when the Prime Minister apologized for this policy of assimilation that caused, as he put it, so much damage to our peoples. Just recently there was a report on our Indigenous languages. Some 5.5% of our people speak fluently our languages, and that there are not enough young people learning the languages for those languages to survive, so that there are some languages now which will become extinct. And so we don't give up. We never give up. We can't give up. We cannot afford to do that. So I was a student at Larry, but actually I dropped out. I was trying to learn Halkamenim, but I really had a hard time learning phonetics from the linguists. I wanted to learn the language as the people spoke it, but I really didn't want to learn it the way the linguists wrote it. But I'm still doing it. I have tapes that I use and listen to and learn the language of the people here. I am fluent in my own language and the language of my peoples. But I was saying we have brilliant academics, people like John Burroughs, who was a professor at University of Victoria. We have June McHugh, who teaches at this law school here. We have Robert Williams, the University of Arizona. Academics like this who are challenging the concepts, that the notion of the doctrine of discovery, for example, that really was the foundation of the early court decisions from Chief Justice Marshall in the United States Supreme Court. We talk about Aboriginal title or Indian title as if it was invented here in Canada. It was an invention of the judicial system under the United States Supreme Court under Chief Justice Marshall in the Marshall cases. And those cases have been kind of just accepted as law, as precedent in this country. The only problem is that in none of those cases, including the earliest case in this country, St. Catherine's Milling, where Indian people were not parties to the litigation, that in fact governments and industry interests were fighting about what the nature of those interests are, and the side issue of what Aboriginal rights were or Indigenous rights came up, and decisions were made about the nature of those interests. So we still have this political reconciliation that we have to sort our way through. In addition to that, we have to revisit some of the so-called precedents and the underlying assumptions. The underlying assumption on Aboriginal title is based on the doctrine of discovery, and the doctrine of discovery is based on this simple concept that European colonies had the right to colonize whatever lands they came across because they were given permission through papal authorities, papal bulls, and that which basically said that as Indigenous peoples, because we were not Christian, we were incapable of holding lands in any significant ways, and so that new colonizing countries finding new lands could claim those lands for their king or their queen, wherever they came from. So there's a change in the wind. I want to tell you just two more things. When I was a law student here, entered in 1976 and graduated in 79, my instructor in evidence was Professor McLaughlin, Beverly McLaughlin. And as we know, she is the Chief Justice. But we got to this part of the course that talked about hearsay evidence and the rules against hearsay. And the exceptions to the rule, there were a limited number of exceptions. Somebody's dying and says, oh, I did this nasty thing to that person, and that information could be admissible as an exception to the rule against hearsay. So my question to her, and it became a source of discussion in the class, was, how are we supposed to tell our story as Indigenous peoples when all of our history is oral? The stories that are passed on to us are oral. We don't have books that we've written. How do we use that information